Hello, my name is Jamie. I'm representing Youth Speaks. I also work with a lot of other poetry organizations as well as a lot of poetry slams in the Bay. I left 2 flyers in front of you for 2 poetry slams to check out. One of them I actually co-founded. There's going to be my business cards in the front if you want to contact me. I teach poetry, K through 12, team building for other businesses, a million different avenues for spoken word. But without further ado, let's hop into it. Can I get a round of applause, please? They say you can't judge a book by its cover. I say you've never been black, never been categorized by the color of your complexion, never been stigmatized because of your skin. To be black in America is to be another author in a never-ending anthology about oppression. It is to be a chapter. A chapter standing under the bloodiest of suns, singing Negro spirituals and songs about freedom. A chapter captured in chains and carried to the table of contents known as this country. And isn't it ironic that they call this the land of the free? To be black in America is to know that you could have been a commodity had you been born 200 years before. 200 years before today, I would have been born a slave. My hands would have been drenched in burgundy blood from picking cotton, and fights, and the right routes to run away. And sometimes, I said, sometimes being black feels like being a prequel to the revolution, or a sequel titled Retaliation. And I'm tired. I said I'm tired of being a walking publication of pain, of being a footnote with no bootstraps to pull myself up. But isn't it heritage for African Americans to turn shit into sugar, to make the margins feel more like a home, to be seen but only as a home for bullets? And you think to live life this graphic one must exist in a novel. To be black in America is to know that you can be target practice at any white man's will. It is to keep your will on standby. It is to stand by injustice and say nothing. If only we could speak every time we were traumatized. So please, remind me how you don't judge books by their cover, or how you don't see color. Remind me again how you can blatantly skim over all of this magnificent black skin. I have one more poem, but also please reach out to me if you want to connect, if you want to collab. My social media is Jamie_the_poet. That's JAMEY_the_poet. I love teaching in schools. I love performing at events like this, creating this dialogue. And also, please, come to the poetry slams on the flyers in front of you. This conversation carries in other places outside of this. So please come, interact with the community. I got one more poem. Can I get another round of applause? During my sophomore year in college, after English 1002, this overprivileged girl from Danville stretched her thin lips and dared to turn my city into nothing more than a black bird on its deathbed. She said, "I never stop in Richmond. You know, I just drive past on my way to school because it's too dangerous." Until this day, an ocean of anger inside of my chest wishes I could have mustered the pride I earned during my 4 years at Richmond High to look her dead in the eyes and say my city is not a buckshot loaded into the barrel of a shotgun. My city is the city of pride and purpose, so how dare you deem it worthless? It is not a black bird on this deathbed about to croak. Rather, it's the black smoke dancing on top of the bonfire as if there's no tomorrow. Yes, my city knows sorrow, has mastered the art of holding death and progress in the same damn breath. It heard the thunder crack of bullets rain on Cutting Boulevard, rinsed the blood off his hands, and didn't even have a moment to mourn, because in the morning it had to become the sun, pulling apart the night sky like blinds to reveal a brand new day. My city is a place of praise. It's the loudest hallelujah that should leap from your lips. It's the alarm clock buzzing in your brain, letting you know it's time to wake up. It's time to wake up. It's time to wake up. My city is made up of melanin and stardust, and blood, and bones. Call it home to the future's biggest protest, because my city is a revolutionary at rest. It's a pulsing heart, the size of a black power fist, on fire, doused in the flames of being forgotten. My city knows how to be forgotten, knows how to tuck itself inside itself. And ain't that all a hood is anyway? Two sides of the same coin, two sets in the same city, two gangs gunning at each other like there isn't a common enemy, like there isn't a multitude of institutions constructed to carry black bodies to cages or coffins. So when I walk into these public schools, overly eager to teach my classes, I do not see a violent crime rate 138% higher than the national average. Instead, I see a body of black and brown students with pebbles of hope thrown so far down their well-shaped hearts that it's hard to walk on the cement without hearing it calling your name. Until this day, I wish I told that girl from Danville to watch the black teens parading 23rd Street with stars in their eyes and gold in their teeth, not knowing that the ounces coiled in their DNA is more precious than anything you can buy on this earth. My city looks a lot like the moon, constantly going through cycles of its own rebirth. Better yet, it's a phoenix rising from its own ashes, ready to reclaim itself, ready to rename itself as something that does not die on the tongue of those who refuses to see its infinite beauty.
Amazing to be here. Thank you all for having us. My name is Cece, or Sierra Gervais to Misa Gordon, but I go by Cece Gervais. I am here on behalf of Youth Speaks. I am also serving as Poet Laureate of Richmond, California. I have been doing this for many years, probably around the last 8 years or so, and I, like Jamie, am a teaching artist, so I get to work with young folks all around the Bay Area, but more specifically in Richmond, California, giving them poetry as a tool to heal themselves. So thank you for allowing us to be here. Hey yo, I wonder which street corner will be home to my R.I.P. altar. I wonder if my killer will walk by and diss me, if my friends will really miss me, if my sisters will stop living because they say that shit too risky. I hear the ghost of my 17-year-old brother gawking at death. Like all his life is a ghetto heroic lyric, so he sings. Yeah, I know you coming, but fuck you. I'm gunning till the bullet take my life. I'm a king till I die, till I'm an angel in the sky. Until then I'ma ride. I claim street corners that don't ever claim me. I'm just a black boy in the hood, that's all I'll ever be. At least I'm living the ghetto dream, even though a nightmare is my reality. But all I got left to say is, Mama, I'm sorry. And shit, we sorry too, that we had to bore you in the soil, planted you with plagues and expected you to grow, never explaining that black boys be the real soldiers and death rates taking over, fighting reflections as a deflection in a catastrophic society, where guns are aimed at the wombs and mothers' hearts are made into permanent tombs because we can never afford to bury you anyway. We can never afford the time to love you anyway. Being a black mother is knowing that the child that made your body into a home will self-destruct from self-hatred like he ain't come from greatness, like he ain't target practice, because his melanin is a sign of royalty, so they hunt you to destroy your seed, say that racism is a thing of the past so they can blind you and come full swing like this ain't just like 1619. Got him singing modern day Negro spirituals, drained of any hope he once had, and I tried to tell him to hold on just a little while longer. Hold on just a little while longer. Hold on just a little while longer. Everything will be alright. Everything will be alright. But no matter how long we hold on, no matter who is holding the gun, all our names are written in hashtags all around our mothers' bodies, which ultimately become our RIP altars. Thank you. Thank y'all so much. So this next poem, I'm nervous, y'all. This next poem, I wanted to intro it because it's very special to me and it is very emotional. It is the first piece that I wrote to the person who killed my cousin. My cousin died around 10 years ago. Gun violence and things in our city, and so this is my attempt to practice forgiveness and understanding and loving my community, no matter how intense it is and how painful it is. So, bear with me. No poems, no words, no songs. Gonna bring my cousin home. No words, no poems, no songs. Gonna bring my cousin home. I want to know your name, as intimate as I want to know the caliber of bullets you used to open up his chest with. A mirrored black body, jaws unhinged, howling, a chant that all black babies are born shouting, a national hymn dug into the pits of our bellies. Your hands are the same as his, you know. Cemented in a prayer stance to a God you may or may not believe in, cuffed tight in the thick of a sooty sky. When I learned you killed my cousin, why I mourned you both, prepared a funeral in my mind, because I know black mothers don't birth murderers. Why you kill yourself that way? Why you take two lives that way? Like we don't deserve to love you. Like all I deserve is mourning what I do but love you through my cousin. What a black woman do but keep loving anyway. If you must know, his name is Devon. And maybe if I speak his smile into existence, you might level with the human in him, or at least level with the human in me, and I am still trying to find some kind of love in all this anger, still trying to find the God in you. But words can't remove bullets, and poems for damn sure can't revive the dead, and death row is not the answer. Cannot persecute a murderer into a confession, cannot turn a confession into a burial, cannot bring my cousin back, nor can it make a murderer understand who my cousin was to me. Have you ever been comforted by a ghost boy who's only there because he can't get to heaven? Black boys can't find no refuge in the afterlife, and I am still trying to find some kind of love in all this anger. Still trying to find the God in you, how I want to write you human, but feel myself losing my grip. Feel my cousin pushing against the pen, telling me to write you gone, write a gun, write a bullet, write a fire, call it an accident, call the pastor, tell the pastor it was an accident, how I want to write you human. But I know that I can't. I know that no matter how much I pray, he's never coming back. But I want to learn how to forgive. I want to be able to see my cousin's obituary as a living poem and not a sacrifice. I want to take your apology, make a mural out of it, and tell our city how we are family again. I want to pray over your wombs and show God how we made a miracle on earth. I want to show my city that we are more than this, that we have always been better than this, but no words, no poems, no songs. Gonna bring my cousin home. No words, no poems, oh, could ever right this wrong. Thank you.
Can we go ahead and stand up and thank these two, Jamie and Cece? Thank you so much for your courage. Thank you all, and your willingness to come and tell your stories. I'm tearing up a little bit. It's very emotional. One of the reasons that I think we started doing this is because I've told this at fundraisers I've been at for unfortunately fallen children here in Vallejo, and we have very similarities of Vallejo and Richmond, right? I live here in Vallejo, I live across from Vallejo High School, so I'm very dedicated to this community. And we have a lot of our own fallen youth here, and so that the purpose of today is to really honor those youth. So if we could just take 10 seconds of silence to honor those, both the perpetrators, the victims, in this cycle of violence that we're all here today to find solutions for. So if you could please give just 10 seconds of silence for that. Thank you. Thank you all so much for your moment. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead. I'll go through the agenda in a bit, but I'm going to welcome our provost up, Dr. Sarah Schweitzer, who has a few words of welcome for you today, and then I'll briefly go over the agenda.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, everybody, for taking time today to come and be a part of this. And again, I want to thank Jamie and Cece again. It was truly, truly amazing, and your strength and your courage to share your voice and to share your experience means so much to your communities, but also to all of us here who represent many communities throughout the North Bay. So thank you. And I want to take a moment to thank Lisa and the College of Education and Health Sciences for putting on this program. Every year, they pick a topic of timeliness and they put together the social justice seminar. So thank you. I know how much work goes into it. I know how much dedication goes into this and the need to serve not just our students, but our communities. So thank you, Lisa, and your team. And then a thank you for all of our panelists today, who you're going to get introduced to very soon, for taking time out of your busy weekend and your busy lives to come and share with us. Because this is really, we need dialogue, but more than that, we need to figure out how we take this dialogue and turn it into action. Because we're here with the understanding that if we're ever going to get to the point where we're addressing educational gaps in our communities, we have to start by making them safer first. Safer, healthier, more educated communities, in that order. And so today we're here to talk about how do we start to address safety in our communities? How do we make this a safe place for our kids to go to school? I'm a parent. I send my child to public school every day, and I'm aware my children walk into a school that may or may not deliver them home to me at the end of the day. And that's what we're here to talk about. How do we end this cycle? So thank you to Jamie and Cece. Thank you to Lisa and her team. And I'm looking forward to spending the day with you all.
All right, thank you, Dr. Schweitzer. So real quickly, I'm just going to go through the agenda. There was a little miscommunication on the program schedule, so I'll kind of explain that. First, I want to go ahead and thank our sponsors that came out today. La Clinica, Natalia, are you in the room? Can you stand up for us, please? Thank you so much. Of course, Youth Speaks, who is exiting the room right now, but Youth Speaks has been with us today. The Fighting Back Youth Development Project, I'm actually on the board of Fighting Back, so thank you, Fighting Back, if you're here today, if you could stand. Awesome, Annalise, there you are. Dr. Mel King's here, who's the Executive Director of Fighting Back. Eric Reyes Foundation, Isabel, I've lost sight of you, but could you please, oh, there you are, right there. From the Eric Reyes Foundation. And we'll talk a little bit more about what the Eric Reyes Foundation is. I saw Patty Navalta. Could you please stand? Patty, thank you so much. From the Robbie Pobletta Foundation is here as well. I just want to thank the committee members before the day gets away from us. Dr. Annette Alberg, could you please stand? Dr. Annette Alberg is actually in our public health department, but she's head of our community track. So Touro is social justice mission-based, and so a lot of what we do is community engagement. And so Annette is one of our fabulous leaders in that area. Jafia Mott, could you please stand? Oh, she's at the back. So Dr. Mott. So Dr. Mott is actually responsible for bringing You Speaks today. So we're very thankful that you served on the committee and helped out. Dr. Justin Hurd, I introduced earlier, is right here, our Director of the Grad School of Education. Gail Cummings is our Director of the Public Health Program and is very involved. And we're going to invite the speakers up just momentarily, but I just want to let you know the reason we decided to do this event was actually the brainchild of Dr. Annette Alberg. She came into my office after what happened last spring with shootings that have been going on over multiple years and said, I want to do something about this, what can we do? And we thought if we did it in the spring, we needed a little more time to plan it well. So then I said, okay, this seems like something the college should do as a whole. Let's go ahead and partner with our grad school of education, because what we need to focus on when we're focusing on violence prevention, safe schools and communities is schools. Schools are an instrumental part, and we have a panel today that is made up of superintendents that's going to kind of address some of the programs in schools. So that's kind of where the inception of the idea came from, and we wanted to invite our students to be a part of the day and an active participant in dialogue and solution. So what we're going to be doing is momentarily I'll be bringing up the panelists for the community policy efforts to promote public safety. That includes Davon Bogan, who's the CEO of Advanced Peace, and he'll tell you more about what that is. Mike McLively, who's the Senior Staff Attorney and Urban Gun Violence Initiative Director. So Mike, if you could raise your hand real quick. Patty Navalta is going to be speaking from the Robbie Pobletta Foundation. And then we have, Patty, if you want to raise your hand one more time. And then we have Isabel Reyes, who will also be up on the panel talking. After that, we're going to have a brief break so you can get some refreshments and water over in the hall area. Then we will come back and have our education panel, which is best practices for safe schools. So the reason we have panelists presenting is because they have had some solutions that they provided that they're going to talk about that have seen results. And the idea of this, after the panels are over, is to break up into small groups. And we have some of our education students that'll help facilitate this to talk about safe schools and communities and how we start the discussion both in Vallejo and then in the Solano County area. So we'll be breaking off into small groups to kind of talk about discussions, and then we'll return to this room to kind of have a share back and next steps. And then we invite you all to reception up. It is kind of up the steps, but it's a really good walk. You'll get lots of steps in on your on your pedometers. And we'll have a reception for those who would like to stay and get some food and some beverages. So without further ado, the only thing we ask, the restrooms are actually, if you go outside this building and go back in where we kind of we directed you that way for a reason. One is to see our tables that we have, and two, that's where the snacks and beverages are and the restrooms. So we can let you know. So you can go out this direction, take a left, and then go this direction, and you will find the restrooms. And then if you all could please, I should have said this before you speaks, but please turn off your cell phones. We want to make sure that we have the full attention of everybody for the panelists, because they have lots of important things to say. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Gail Cummings to come up and introduce our panelists, and ask that our panelists start to come up to the stage so we can have you kind of sit here. And in the meantime, I'm going to clear the screen.
Good afternoon, and welcome again to Touro University. My name is Gail Cummings. I'm the Program Director and Assistant Dean for the Public Health Program. I just asked Gary to put Cece's picture back up, just because it's such a beautiful picture, and it's a good reminder for all of us to understand why we do this work. And it's really important that we support the arts in our schools to understand the importance and significance of the meaningfulness of this kind of work with regard to dealing with and coping with such challenging issues such as gun violence. So I'm sorry that they had to leave, but that was very moving, and I'm sure we all sort of felt the significance and of that poetry session, and it's a wonderful way to start out these really challenging and difficult discussions. Thank you, Lisa, for providing the introductions to our panelists. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time doing that, but I just wanted to reiterate from the Public Health Program that we're so honored to be a part of this panel. Being able to bring this to the attention to our community here in Vallejo, and be able to introduce you as such dynamic change makers in this issue around gun violence and gun violence prevention. From the public health perspective, as you all... I'm wondering if the light is bothering the panelists coming from the slide. Is it? Is it a little bit? A little bit bright?
It's okay. Yeah.
I just wanted to... Thanks. So one of the reasons we have such a dynamic panel is obviously because of all the work that you're doing, but we also understand in the public health program that this issue is so complicated. It requires a multidisciplinary approach. There's not one solution, although we do understand the root causes are social and environmental, but it's so important to have voices such as yours be a part of looking at solutions to this important work. So from our policy experts to individuals here on our panel who have experienced personal losses to gun violence here in our community. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to our panelists, and I believe it's going to be Devon Bogan who will start us off. And I believe you have a microphone.
Got a live mic. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Y'all got to do way better than that. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Right on. Y'all doing good?
Yeah.
Good. I'm Devon Bogan. I serve as Chief Executive Officer for Advanced Peace. Advanced Peace reduces gun violence in urban neighborhoods by providing transformative opportunities to those at the center of firearm hostilities in those urban communities. We provide an 18-month fellowship opportunity, much like a postgraduate school like fellowship, to active, I want to say this because I want you to be very clear about who I'm talking about, active firearm offenders who have avoided any criminal or legal consequence for their acts or suspected acts of gun violence. So on day one of one's 18-month fellowship engagement, these guys are actively involved in gun violence, and they're committed to their active involvement in gun violence. So this fellowship is designed for that, not designed for an individual who's made a decision to remove him or herself from that firearm activity, but one who's actually dug in his feet and is determined to continue to use a firearm as a conflict resolution tool. Now, you may be asking a very appropriate question and a common question that often gets asked, and that is, why are those individuals not incarcerated? It is a crime to use a firearm in the commission of a conflict in California. to harm someone or to kill someone. And what most of us don't often know is that less than 30% of the individuals involved in gun violence in urban neighborhoods will ever see a day of incarceration as a result of their suspected acts of gun violence. So, for example, in Chicago, a city that many people see as the firearm-related capital of the country, and it is not, there are more violent cities. Over the last 2 years, 1,400 firearm-related homicides have occurred, and less than 25% of the individuals responsible or thought to be responsible for those activities will ever see a day of time for that suspected act of gun violence. So this work is about being dedicated to engaging individuals that law enforcement, in fact, has had a tough time engaging. And this engagement is simply about how do we keep a young man or woman who is committed to using a firearm to solve conflict, even with intensified law enforcement attention and, in their minds, harassment, from crossing that line again. How do we keep him or her from crossing that line again? And in fact, how do we push them further and further away from that line when law enforcement apparently isn't able to do so with many of these individuals who will remain involved in recurrent, cyclical, and retaliatory firearm activity in those very communities where they perhaps committed their first firearm activity. So Advanced Peace is also the replication organization for this fellowship that originated in the city of Richmond, California, where I served as neighborhood safety director for 8 years. And I'll tell you a little bit of a story, and that'll wrap up my part of the presentation in terms of what one city did to address its historical prevalent nature of gun violence. In 2005, the city of Richmond's gun violence was heading into a new high. A city of 100,000 people or less had an average of 35 homicides per year by firearm between 1986 and 2004. In 2005, the city began to see its homicide rate by firearm increase. That is to say, it went from 40 to 42, and by 2007, the city had nearly 50 homicides by firearm, At that same time, in those earlier days, 2005, 2006, believe it or not, the city of Richmond was considered the third most dangerous city in the country. And the city considered bringing in the California Guard, or the National Guard representation in California. It also considered and did increase its policing activities in 2005. But it didn't see much change in what was happening on the streets in those neighborhoods most impacted by gun violence. So the city of Richmond, I would argue, got sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I think that oftentimes is what is required for cities who are not only interested but committed to reducing gunfire that happens in its jurisdiction. It decided what we're doing is not enough. Not to say that what we're doing isn't good, but we're not achieving the results that we want to achieve in our city as it relates to gunfire reduction. So we're going to do something else. We're going to, and what the city did, very important policy and practice opportunity, is it decided to create the first of its kind Office of Neighborhood Safety inside city government, a non-law enforcement agency that would be solely responsible for reducing firearm activity in the city without a law enforcement framework. So law enforcement was going to continue to do the activities that it had been doing, but the city decided we also need to do something else, and we're going to create a new institution in government that's not law enforcement to help us get to our optimal outlook on this issue in our city. It hired me to serve as neighborhood safety director. I also helped author the recommendation that brought the ratification of the office into being. Hires me as the neighborhood safety director, and my responsibility, pure and simple, reduce gunfire. If that didn't happen, then I was going to certainly be out of a job. It wasn't about how many jobs I could get other people. It wasn't about how many programs I could get people into, how much great mentoring we could increase in our city's jurisdiction. If I did all of those things well and gun violence wasn't reduced, I would be sent packing. And that was important for me to recognize as well, because it kept me very focused, deliberate, and intentional on what my charge was as neighborhood safety director there. A couple of things I did initially that I think I should offer to you. Once we got the office established and I began to look at sort of the personnel that I wanted to have occupy the office, I determined that the first people that I would hire were active firearm offenders. Yes, I was going to identify young men under 20 who the community thought were actively involved in gun violence on their first day of their work with me at that office. So I had a community member help me identify 3 young men under 20 who could work together. I found a classification inside the government personnel board policy. It said office aide. And I can tell you, these young men couldn't do that job. But it was a job that I could get them hired to simply be a part of the vehicle, the mechanism. Why? Because this office was supposed to be about them. And it should importantly be informed by them. I wanted them to tell me when my breath stank. I wanted them to tell me when that idea is not going to work. That's the stupidest, most privileged perspective idea I've ever heard. I also wanted to experience what their lives were like. You know, active firearm offenders are also the most likely to become a victim of gun violence. One of our young men who worked with us initially was shot 5 times on 5 different occasions while he was sort of an intern at the Office of Neighborhood Safety. So you can imagine what it was like for me to have to go to the hospital, to the trauma center, with his family and with the family of others that were committed to retaliation on his behalf, right? I can tell you today, though, because I won't be able to tell you later, that same young man I'm talking about is in his first year of law school at Central Florida University. And he did that. I mean, he did that. He did all that work. But when he showed up at our office, law enforcement told me, that's a serial shooter that you've got inside city government. And they thought that was outrageous and ridiculous. And I get it. But I thought it was important to have their presence and their voice offer and be directive to the policy and practices that this office would be setting forth. Why? Because without thinking about it, they were informing policing policy in our city. Without thinking about it, they were informing the policing budget in our city. And I can tell you in 2009, we had 3 police officers in the city of Richmond making more than $300,000 a year, based on the overtime justified by violent crime in our city. Now, I can't tell you how many were making under 3, between $250 and $3, but a lot more than the 5 or 6 we had making 3. Our policing overtime budget per month was $600,000 per month, justified on the actions of men like the young man represented in the first part of that story. The second group of people that we hired, we knew we were going to facilitate what was known as a street outreach strategy. That is, hiring individuals that had a common experience with the individuals involved in gun violence, who could provide themselves as a living example of what change looks like and how to make change, but also who could connect those individuals to services that they sorely needed within the community and without the community. So I took another big leap that I think is important for folks to hear here. I said to the city manager, I want to hire inside city government full-time, fully vested employees who are formerly incarcerated returning citizens. And I want each of them to have a gun charge in their background. Yeah, that's the kind of looks I got from the personnel board and the human resources director and the city attorney when I recommended that idea, right? But we were able to get it done. The first time in the country this office is established. The first time in this country where formerly incarcerated individuals would be brought in as government employees, paid well, benefited well, who were formerly incarcerated with gun charges in their background. Why? Because that common experience was going to be important for us in our efforts to connect directly with the individuals who were responsible for gun violence in our city. Two, those individuals had to come from within those communities, right? So they had to have a license to operate. They had to have credibility, right? They had to have some understanding of what was the nature of gun violence and who was driving the gun violence in our city, in our community. So those were two important things that we did initially. The second thing we did is we deployed these individuals only in those areas of town where gun violence was most prevalent. So the message there is intensified, concentrated focus, not only on an area where gun violence is happening, but on the folks most responsible for that gun violence. We don't have a whole lot of resources. Well, we didn't. Other departments did. So we knew we had to be surgical in our approach in focusing on those individuals. By doing that, we saw a very significant precipitous drop in gun violence after our first year. But after our first year had concluded and we began our second year, we saw an uptick. Now, I don't have time to talk about the uptick, but what I'll tell you is what I learned as a result of the uptick. In early 2010, I found myself in a room with several law enforcement agencies working gun crimes in the Richmond community. Probably agencies totaling $4 or $5 million of activity in our city to try to reduce gunfire. And what I continued to hear from these 6 or 7 law enforcement agencies was that in their discussion about 2009 firearm activity, 45 homicides by firearm in 2009, nearly 200 non-fatal shootings with an injury in our city in 2009. They believed that 17 people were responsible for 70% of that activity. Now, if you were watching Channel 2 KTVU News during that year, you would have thought we were talking about Beirut when you talked about Richmond, because gunfire was happening often, every night, right? When I heard 17 people informing our narrative, the narrative of our city, I figured, wow, we can get our hands on that. What I also learned was those 17 people were walking the streets, weren't prosecuted in the same neighborhoods where the gun violence had occurred. So they were out. What I asked law enforcement to do was to get me an unduplicated list of who those people were on each of their 7 lists. Turned out to be 28 people. Still, we can get our arms around that. So what I did next was I took $1.2 million budget and decided it's not going to engage 300 people a year. It's going to engage 28 people a year. Yes, we're going to take a $1.2 million budget and get even more surgical with our focus and concentration on those most responsible for gun violence. And that's what we did. We used every resource we had available to us to engage those 28 people. And we created a fellowship with 25 of them. We had lost 3 of them within 90 days of learning who they were. And that fellowship is something that we are now replicating across California and across the country. And I'll say in closing, because I'm getting signs and messages and eyes, and I see you. That fellowship is grounded in evidence-based, a strong dosage of mentoring, case management, street outreach, life skills training, cognitive behavioral therapy, and subsidized employment, wrapped into 7 intensive touch points. Life Map, which is a life management action plan for every active firearm offender that we're engaging. Daily engagement for an 18-month period, multiple times a day by multiple people. Every single day for 18 months. Multiple people, multiple times a day of positive, healthy engagement. 3, connecting them to the available social services that make sense for us to connect them with. 4, providing them with what we call an allowance. We provide them with up to $1,000 a month over the course of their 18-month fellowship based on goals achieved within their life maps. 5, transformative travel. We've taken fellows who have been trying to kill each other together around the globe several times over. 6, Council of Elders, and 7, after 18 months, because we don't get cats jobs, after 18 months, for those that are ready, we connect them to an internship based on what we've learned about them, based on what we think is their passion and their interests. 84 fellows between 2010 and 2016. 94% of them are alive today. 83% of them haven't been injured by a firearm since becoming a fellow. 77% of them are not a suspect in a new firearm crime since becoming a fellow. That has translated into a 66 to 71% sustained reduction in gun violence in the city of Richmond, and we're excited about that.
Mention that they use law enforcement to deal with violence, right? He said they had a non-law enforcement city agency that's dealing with highest risk folks. And I think in this country, we've been suffering from a lack of imagination when it comes to addressing violence for decades now, if not centuries, where we've said violence is a crime, gun violence is a crime, and therefore police and law enforcement are the only segment of our population that has any business trying to address it or deal with it. And when you look at where that has gotten us, it is not the reductions in violence that we want, and incredible increases in mass incarceration that has devastated many segments of our community. So I'm really thrilled that we're having a public health school and a public health emphasis on this problem, because I think we will start to see the needle move when we have creative solutions like Devone brought to Richmond that are embraced by community, that are embraced by health professionals, saying that instead of just locking someone up, we're going to understand what actually caused the violent behavior and bringing resources to the folks that are engaged in that behavior. And I think that could create a real sea change on this issue. So I want to say thank you to everyone for taking the time to be here on a Sunday to learn about this. So my name is Mike McLively. I'm a senior staff attorney at Giffords Law. Devone just sucked it all up there. We're a gun violence prevention group based in San Francisco. We do work all over the country. So we're named after Gabby Giffords, whose name you might recognize. She's the congresswoman that was shot in 2011 in Arizona while she was doing an event. So we have offices in San Francisco. We also now have an office in DC. We look at all 50 states across the country in addressing this issue. We work with legislators, we work with activists. We have some publications that are available if you want to learn more. Our website has tons of information. You can find us at giffordslawcenter.org or smartgunlaws.org, which I think is easier to remember. So just really quickly, what does gun violence look like in this country? There are close to 40,000 people that are killed every single year in this country. That's been ticking upwards in recent years. And then tens of thousands more that are non-fatally shot and injured. And I think that's important because our conversation is so much around deaths, and the media reports a lot about how of those close to 40,000 deaths, 2/3 are suicide. And that is true, and we absolutely need to deal with that issue. But at the same time, so much violence is homicide and also non-fatal shootings that are happening in our cities like Richmond, like Vallejo. And that conversation is not, I feel like, not happening at the national level, right? So much of our conversation is driven by mass shootings and how do we address mass shootings. Not that we should ignore that problem, but here's a stat that I think puts this into perspective. 2012 was the year of the Aurora that movie theater shooting in Colorado. Folks will remember that. That year, 90 people died in mass shootings. And obviously that shouldn't happen. But that same year, we had more than 8,000 Black and Latino men were killed in day-to-day shootings that didn't make national headlines, right? So I'm not a public health expert, but I have been meeting and speaking with folks in this field from a long time. And I think one of the principles of public health is you have to find out what is driving a problem, and then you move your resources there. So to say, that this is 100% suicide and we should put all resources there is wrong. And I think the approach is you have to look at what's driving the bulk of shootings, and that is interpersonal shootings in our cities. And like Devone was mentioning, Richmond is not unique, everybody. We should know that in city after city, and I'm sure it's the same here in Vallejo, although I haven't looked at the numbers, but there is a very small percentage of individuals who are driving the vast majority of shootings. It's not like when you just look at the media and watch the TV, you would think it's bedlam. There's gunfire everywhere. You can't walk down the street without being shot. People who live in communities can tell you that's not the case. And the good news there is that if you can bring resources to that small percentage of people, that's actually a manageable problem, right? Like we can't just solve all social ills, fix all the schools. Obviously we need to do those things, but if you try to take that on, you're taking on an enormous project that is not likely to succeed. But if you break this down, like Devone did in Richmond, and say, all right, we're gonna find out who are the 25 folks who are driving the majority of violence in our city, and we're gonna bring resources to them, and we're gonna help them change their behaviors, and actually wrap our arms around them in a positive, healthy way, as opposed to identify them, label them as bad guys, and do our best to try to put them in prison, you can have a major impact on this issue. So what I've been doing with our Urban Gun Violence Initiative the last few years is looking across the country to see how are cities addressing this issue and what are some of the best practices. And what we see, the cities that are having success, like Richmond, are taking this model where they start with identifying what the problem is, right? Doing a deep problem analysis. And I'll give you a quick example of what this looks like. So the city of Oakland, which you're all familiar with, has also had success the last few years. And in the last maybe 15 years ago, everyone in Oakland who was addressing violence was under the impression that most violence was caused by young people, and that it was fueled by sort of disputes about drugs, right? And this is just sort of a story that comes out in the media, and that's what people generally believe. Well, when they actually did an analysis and looked at data, it turns out that only 10% of shootings involved people under the age of 18, and less than 12% were drug-related. So they had resources in place to address, frankly, the wrong problem, or at least not the bulk of the problem. So over time, they've taken their resources, and part of the story with Oakland is that they've passed these ballot initiatives, one back in 2004 called Measure Y, and then recently in 2014, this was reinstated in what is called Measure Z, that's provided through a parcel tax, so people who own real estate pay like $100 extra a year, and an increase in parking fines in commercial spots. That has created millions and millions and millions of dollars in the city of Oakland, and almost half of that has been earmarked for non-law enforcement solutions to violence. So public health solutions, similar to what Devone's talking about. So their Department of Human Services is identifying folks who are at highest risk of being involved with gun violence and reaching out to them using street outreach workers. And like Devone was saying, these are folks who come from impacted communities. It's so important. They have access, they have knowledge, and can be incredibly effective in reaching out to these highest risk individuals. So engaging that way, and then they have a whole system of providing resources to victims of violence. And this is another really important point that Devone made, which is there is a huge overlap between your population of perpetrators and victims. It's not like you have victims over here and perpetrators over here. There's overlap. And today's victim of gun violence could be tomorrow's perpetrator. And we see this in our hospitals. There's a huge injury recidivism rate where people who are coming in within 5 years, let's say someone comes in for a gunshot wound, in a lot of urban areas, there's a 45% chance that that person will be back in with a serious injury within 5 years. And so one of the solutions that Oakland has put in place and other areas is called hospital-based violence intervention program, right? So in the hospital, while someone's recovering from an injury, they're being connected with culturally competent case managers who can talk to them, get to know them, understand what was it that brought you here to the hospital in the first place, and then start to address those issues over time. So those are just examples, but what we're seeing is cities that are actually putting those things together and intervening with the folks at highest risk are seeing incredible results. That includes Oakland, Richmond. The city of LA has a $30 million budget to do this exact type of work. And all of these solutions it only involve law enforcement to the extent that law enforcement is sharing information that might be useful for outreach workers in doing their job. So I do think law enforcement could be part of the solution, and to the extent you're here in the community, building relationships with police is necessary, right? Because there's police community relationships in areas where there's a lot of violence have been strained, and the police strategy for addressing violence in most cities has been, let's see where there's violence. We're going to put and deploy as many officers as we can in that area, and our measure of success will be how many people did we arrest? Not did we arrest the right people who maybe committed a homicide, but just strict numbers. Did we arrest 100 people, 500 people? If we arrested 500 people, great, we're doing our job. Well, you can imagine how that would create major problems because people in the community know who's responsible generally for serious crimes like homicide, and they don't see them being arrested. So there's a huge issue with retaliation. It also sends a message that the government, the system, doesn't care about you. You call the police to say my son was murdered and don't get a call back. What is the message that's sent there? So there's a ton of reform work that's necessary when it comes to how police address violence. So really, I think it depends what you see in your community. If you see an issue with the police department and how they're doing their job, you need to get active and advocate and start building relationships up so that that gets changed. But what I would just sort of close with is where we're seeing the most success, solutions are driven by the community. And I think Devon might be an exception where you had a city employee who had vision, who was not afraid to be innovative. But I'll know he just told me a few minutes ago, he went out and talked to tons of community members and got input from so many people before he rolled out the advanced peace model. And that has to happen. The sort of top-down approach where you come in with this prepackaged solution and say, okay, Vallejo, here's what we're going to do to address violence, that won't work. You need to understand local dynamics. So to the extent that you guys are interested in addressing violence here in your community, or wherever your community may be, maybe it's Vallejo or somewhere else, that's where things need to start, is wrapping your head around the actual problem, and then having community advocates meeting with your leaders and talking to them again and again that we have to think outside the box. We can't just use law enforcement to address this problem, and we're just going to keep getting the same results we've been getting. So I'm excited to see this sort of public health approach to violence gaining traction. Organizations like ours are recognizing that, like, yes, we need universal background checks, we have to deal with access to firearms in our communities, but that is necessary but not sufficient to fully address this problem. Right? That's part of the solution, but we absolutely have to lift up these community-based strategies that are seeing results. So I'll just end by saying part of what we're trying to do here in California is to increase the pool of funds that are available for cities to address violence. So right now there's a program called CalVIP, the California Violence Intervention and Prevention Program. It's a $9 million program for a state that has a $160 billion budget, probably more than that. So it's a drop in the bucket, and we're really trying to increase the amount of money that's out there for cities and community-based organizations to resource themselves to professionalize this work, right? Because Devon's saying a street outreach worker is getting paid a fraction of what a law enforcement or your standard police officer is getting paid. And what message does that send? It's that we care more about law enforcement and police and locking people up than we do addressing the problem through community. So we have to turn that around and really professionalize and adequately pay the people who are doing incredibly important and dangerous work and who are really making a big impact on gun violence. So Last thing I'll say, if you want to get more information about what we're doing, sort of working up in the policy space to try to support the type of work that you heard Devone talking about and that you'll hear more about here, you can visit our website, smartgunlaws.org, reach out, send us a message. We're happy to help you address some of the local problems that you might have and work especially with, city leaders to help them understand that this is the right thing to do. And because gun violence is such an expensive problem, it costs so much to treat people, to pay police, to investigate crimes, that to invest in community-based solutions makes so much sense. It's the moral thing to do, and it's also economically the right thing to do, and city leaders really listen to that. So there's a lot that you can do, and I hope that you take what we've been hearing today and move forward with it and keep going. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Isabel Reyes, and I have been deeply affected to gun violence. I lost my son to gun violence February 6, 2016. My son was a second homicide victim in Vallejo for the 2016. On February 6, Eric was going out for breakfast with his cousin, and he was driving in the neighborhood, and 3 guys came up to him and just shot him. He didn't know the guys. These 3 individuals who took my son's life had chased another individual prior to my son and pulled guns on him, but didn't shoot that first person, but came to my son and shot my son. I don't know why. I asked myself why was the first person was able to drive away and my son wasn't. And the only thing I could say was the first person was Caucasian and my son was Latino. That's what I think as a mother, why the first victim was able to drive away. My son had a 4.0 GPA. He was on the superintendent's honor roll. He was getting ready to graduate high school. We were actually planning his graduation party. He was so excited. It's kind of hard to talk about it, but to this day, I still keep my son's memory alive. In his honor, I started a foundation. It's Eric Reyes Foundation. We're on our second gun buyback that we partnered up with Patty, Robbie Pobletti Foundation. And we also do scholarships for kids in Vallejo, and we also do tutoring and school supplies for the youth, because that's what Eric was doing in his senior year. He was helping his fellow students with their classwork. And it's just amazing to say that how gun violence does destroy families. My life is totally changed. My son's life, everybody is just changed. I still haven't gone back to work full-time. I was off of work for 8 months. I went back part-time. I'm up at, I think, 25 hours now, but I'm getting there. It is hard. It's hard just to go out in the community, but I'm doing this because I want our kids to be safe in Vallejo. I have grandkids. So that's why I'm here today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Patty Navalta Pobletti, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Robbie Pobletti Foundation. And unfortunately, like Isabel, I too lost my son to gun violence here in Vallejo, September 21st, 2014. Robbie was 23, and he was my only son. A week before he was shot, he was working at Genentech with his father, and he was learning how to weld, and he was working on the machines there at Genentech, and he had laid out his suit because all that needed to be done to make it official was a job interview. So he had set out his suit on his bed for his job interview, and then that ended up being the suit that we buried him in. Within seconds, a life can change, a life can end. And I don't think, when you hear about the statistics, but you don't know what happens after the headline runs in the paper. There is a ripple effect. Beyond what you see in the headlines, you have numerous families, numerous friends who are debilitated with grief, with PTSD. I could not return to this city for 2 years after Robbie was shot and killed, and I lived here since I was in third grade. I would go the extra 30 minutes just to avoid driving through Vallejo because the PTSD was so strong. And during that time, I started writing a book because I couldn't find comfort in any books I found in the bookstore. There were very religious books which did not speak to me because I was angry at God. And I questioned if there even was a God, because if there is, how could he let this happen to my son and to our family? So I rejected anything that had to do with religion because I was going through a real crisis of faith. And the other books I found on grief were very prescriptive. You know, get up, look in the mirror and say this. And that too did not speak to me because grief is very unique. And it's not linear. It's not 1 through 3, you're going to feel anger. 4 through 6, you're going to feel pain. No, you can go from accepting it 1 hour to being angry within minutes. So those books didn't speak to me. And I wrote a book that I wished was available to me when I was going through the grief, and it was as raw and heartbreaking and honest as I could be, because there is no sugarcoating what gun violence does to an individual, to a family, to a mother. And I felt like that story needed to be told. And during the course of writing that book, I think I was at the penultimate chapter when I realized I still have not gone back to this city that was my home for 3 decades. And the reason I couldn't go back was because I remember that drive getting on 80 from Fairfield to Vallejo, frantic, stuck in traffic with my husband weaving through and not knowing, why aren't they calling to tell me where my son is, what hospital is he at? And they didn't tell me he was already lying dead at a parking lot, surrounded by police tape. And I couldn't make that drive because it triggered so many memories of that destination of a crime scene. And when I wrote the book, I thought, well, what if I change the narrative where the destination is not the crime scene, but it's a place of hope? And that hope has to come from something that I create and activities that I take. And that's when I decided to start the Robbie Poblete Foundation. Now, every program that we have in this foundation is tied to my son's story. We approach gun violence in a 3-pronged way. We have the gun buyback, which Isabel talked about. She was our first partner. We're just about to do our second gun buyback in Vallejo. We've also partnered in Richmond. We've had 2 buybacks in Richmond now. San Francisco, we've had a buyback there with our partners, United Players, and City of Berkeley now is going to adopt our programs and have our buyback. What makes our buybacks unique is that once the materials are collected, not just from buybacks, but we've also partnered with private firms that destroy firearms collected from throughout the state. So these are firearms that are directly related to homicides and violent crimes. They come to us decommissioned, and then we redistribute them to artists to create into art. And those exhibits have been featured throughout the Bay Area. What does that mean? So for my son, he was learning how to weld, and he was collecting a lot of scrap metal, and he was going to turn that into art. For me, we had our first Art of Peace launched here in downtown Vallejo at the Temple Art Lofts, and I saw people in tears because of the power of these pieces. If you look closely, you could see the gun parts, but if you look from far, you wouldn't know that these were made from weapons that were once used to kill people. And there is power in art, because art has the ability to touch the heart. And when you touch the heart, you can change the mind. And I think that's the power of our Art of Peace project, which now has been adopted in numerous counties. Our next one will be Art of Peace San Francisco, where Mayor London Breed will unveil the pieces of art at San Francisco City Hall. And we're in talks with the San Francisco Arts Commission to have that travel to San Francisco Airport. Our third program, because my son was learning how to weld, is our vocational program. When I looked up the 4 men who shot and killed my son, I saw a long history of them being in the criminal justice system. And I remember thinking, if they had just learned a trade, if they had just attained the job skills so that they could earn a living wage and not turn to violent crime as their only means of living, maybe my son would still be here. So even though the foundation has my son's name, that third program is really geared toward the people who killed him, because I wish someone had helped them. I wish someone had told them this isn't the only way. And what we do is we go to school, we work with the school districts, I partner with the county courts, with the reentry programs, with nonprofits that deal with homeless population, and we give them scholarships to get into the building trades programs and commercial driving. So those scholarships range anywhere from $650 to $6,500. And just yesterday, I spoke at the graduation ceremony at Michael's Transportation Services, where we have provided scholarships for students there, and now they're going to be making 20 plus an hour. These are men who've been incarcerated most of their lives. And I would rather have them come out and learn how to build a home than rob a home. And that's where we come from. So I guess I would just close by saying, it's really hard for us. I hope none of you ever experience what Isabel and I have experienced, but we put our hearts out there because that's all we have left. Our sons aren't here, and I don't want my son, when people hear the name Robbie Poblete, to just associate that with homicide victim. I want that to people to associate his name with a foundation that has made changes in the community, that has saved lives, that have given opportunities where there were no opportunities before. And having a fallen child, that's your greatest and most heartbreaking motivation, but that's where I come from. So I thank you for having us here today.
Well, I think first we should take a moment to thank and appreciate these deeply personal experiences shared by the two mothers on our panel, and appreciate the work that you're doing in your grief, in hopes of making our city of Vallejo a healthier and safer place. So thank you both for participating today. And I believe for our entire panel, we have about 10 minutes for Q&A, and I'm sure there are lots of questions that can go beyond this time in our panel discussion. So if you have questions, I think we have someone who will.
So I have a question for Devon. What role do your alumni play?
It's a great question. Couple, and we do have alumni. We call them ambassadors. And the role they play are at least twofold. One, helping us discover who the next generation of fellows should be, really helping to corroborate the different pieces of information we get about the folks that may benefit most from the work we're doing. So they can help us corroborate that better than anybody most of the time. Two, they are the product, right? They themselves have had a transformative moment, an opportunity, and who better to articulate what that looks like, how it came about, and the credibility of it. So they play that role as well. The question that I most often get around our past fellows is, do they then become neighborhood change agents, the street outreach workers? And the answer is no. And I think that's an unfortunate misunderstanding for folks who actually think that's the next best place for them. These young men will always have targets on their backs. They will always have targets on their backs. What we've done a good job at is keeping these young men clean as they continue to live in a mud puddle. And these young men know how to stay out of the way. They'll tell you, I just need to stay out of the way. Well, they know how to do that. So we don't want to ever put them directly and intentionally in the line of potential fire, not only from their apparent or suspected victims, but understand this is a difficult challenge also for law enforcement to negotiate, and they can become targets that way too. These are young men who have at one time are thought to be firearm offenders. They're walking the street, albeit this is not a get out of jail card or doesn't provide them any kind of immunity. But once they change their lives, the likelihood of law enforcement being able to build a case against them becomes less and less and less.
Thank you.
just wanted to make available a resource for you guys. So I mentioned our website. We have a whole report called Healing Communities in Crisis that goes over what we think are some of the strongest and most innovative solutions around the country, and we talk in pretty good detail about what's been going on in Richmond and Devon's work. So Healing Communities in Crisis, if you just Google that or go to smartgunlaws.org, you can learn a lot more about some of the solutions we've been talking about.
Well, it looks like now I would like to again thank our panel of speakers today. Thank you so much for your time today, and some of them will stick around for our intimate discussions, and then we, of course, do have a reception following our small group discussions today. So let's give them a warm